Hello everyone, JD here. This presentation is entitled Voting, Campaigns, and Elections. So let's get started. Objectives. Discuss the expansion of voting rights to different groups of people since the nation's inception. Secondly, explain the multiple factors associated with a person casting a ballot. Next, identify sources of information that voters use to decide which candidate they will support. And lastly, explore the role of money in the election process, including limits placed upon raising it from different sources. The right to vote. Wider suffrage for men. And it needs to be mentioned here that women were rarely allowed to vote. There are some exceptions, specific places which I'll mention, but we have to acknowledge that at the outset. Every colony imposed a property qualification, and many denied the franchise, which means the right to vote, to Catholics, Jews, Native Americans, and freed black slaves. If you take a U.S. history class, you may talk about how there were some free blacks who were able to vote. However, that number is going to be relatively small. And so we do see a list of people. Oftentimes we don't mention Catholics or Jews. That definitely needs to be stated here, right? Restrictions, survive the revolution intact. You think about the ideas that are circulating in Europe during the intellectual movement known as the Enlightenment, like the concept of a natural right, is going to find its way to the United States. It's going to inform the thinking of the founders. The founders are people like Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, Ben Franklin, George Washington, Alexander Hamilton. Now, they were not a monolith. That's, first of all, a limited list because the list is much longer. But these people are not all the same. They looked at a governing system and the institutions within it in different ways. And so I don't want to give anyone the impression that these folks all thought the same, because they simply didn't. The reason why I bring this up is because these ideas were able to coalesce that allowed us to build this system composed of these institutions. However, we all know that the founders were flawed, and we also know that the concept of a right is not going to be extended to everyone. And yeah, that certainly is a contradiction for people who are talking about opening up the process to more people within a democratic system or a democratic republic. So, restrictions survive the revolution intact. Stories since that time has been progressive, if frustratingly slow. Attitudes take a long time to change. And it's worth mentioning here, this is just another example. The expansion, and that is voting rights, had to overcome philosophical objections and resistance rooted in the mundane calculations of political advantage. However, triumph of nearly universal adult suffrage reflects powerful appeal of democratic ideas combined with profound social changes, the struggles of dedicated activists, and perpetual scramble of politicians for votes. Think of it like this. Once an idea is part of the public discourse, it's definitely going to inform the way people think, which means each one of us has a lens through which we see the world. Ideas will inform that lens. Attitudes change over time. The institutions, therefore, will change over time because these institutions are of human design. We have to keep that in mind here. And also, there are people who are pushing for change to occur. That's what activists do. Activists oftentimes have a vision of a world that doesn't yet exist, and then they try to find ways to close the gap between what we're currently experiencing and where they see us in the future, where they think we could be. And oftentimes it's for the better. Lastly, there's the politicians. These people I'm going to put this one. Last, there's politicians. These people obviously need supporters in order to win a position, like a seat in government. So they can be beneficiaries of opening up the process to more people. And then they're going to want to court those voters and say, hey, please cast your ballot for me on election day because I have the position on these issues that you're going to find compelling. Right? Okay. Also want to add this. Most adults are poor, illiterate, and dependent. Servants, tenants, hired hands, and paupers. Now, the restrictions that you're going to see in the colonies that will then become the early republic United States of America, those were brought from England. However, one big distinction or major distinction between life in the colonies and life in England, and not just England, but also other parts of Europe, is going to be the much more rigid social order that exists in Europe. And that includes the issue about people being able to own land. There's far more of it in what becomes the United States that's available to people than what exists in Europe. And when we say rigid social order, there's nobility and there's clergy and peasants. And if you ever take a Western civilization or a world civilization class, you'll talk more about this, but the land is going to be more evenly distributed here, or distributed. Okay. Now, is it ideal? Depends on who you ask. Some people would say absolutely not, that there were some people who were left out of the economic system. I just want to mention that. So we're going to leave it at that for that point. I also want to add this. Upper class, they constitute a minority of people. We say minority is like a small group of people. They're well-born, prosperous, and educated, and often highly educated. Took for granted their right to govern, not about to risk the existing social order by extending voting rights to people. Think of it like this. You might have a democracy, and really we need to qualify and say a democratic republic where you elect officials to go on your behalf to make decisions. Power still exists in democratic republic. Some people want to hold on to more of it because of concerns that they might potentially lose that position that they have in society in the event that you open it up too much to other people. And to be honest, if you read about this, and I've read about it, if you think about founders like Thomas Jefferson, Alexander Hamilton, each of them had very different views on average everyday people. People like the folks who are all listening to this presentation, I include myself in that, one delivering this presentation, is that Alexander Hamilton, did not trust everyday people because he didn't think that they actually had the ability to participate in the system in a way that would be conducive to institutional development. I mean, on some level, he might have been frightened of opening up the process too much, because what might that mean for people like himself? Okay, that's what I'll say about that. Revolutionary War exerted influence on the demands to enlarge the franchise. This goes back to the point of once you put ideas out there in the public discourse or public domain, people are talking about them, you can't take them back. And the more people talk about them, the more they're going to reevaluate the political system. And then they're going to say, well, wait a second, I want to be able to participate. Why is that some people and not others? That doesn't make any sense. And they'd be correct. It doesn't make any sense. As a matter of principle, it doesn't make any sense. I like to talk about our bedrock principles. We oftentimes did not live up to the principles that we claim to hold dear. Right? So people ask tough questions and eventually changes emerge, sometimes with an awful lot of pushing for that change to occur. Rallying cry against England of, quote, no taxation without representation, which should sound very familiar. Initially, a demand for home rule also implied that anyone who paid taxes should have the right to vote. Men who risked their lives for independence felt entitled to full political citizenship, right? Think about the concept of what does it mean? We say citizenship. What rights are extended to various people? Well, if you're asking individuals to make the ultimate sacrifice or to risk the ultimate sacrifice, it would follow that they would be able to help choose the personnel of government, which would be electing people to office. Still, universal suffrage for white men wasn't fully achieved until the 1840s. 1840s. I don't know why I'm thinking 1900s. 1840s. This is in part a byproduct of Jacksonian democracy. Defensive suffrage restrictions. Of course, there will be people who push back. And, I want to add this in the mix here. this idea that whenever people put forth a vision of a society that makes others uncomfortable, at first people laugh you off. They dismiss you. They say, that doesn't make any sense. Then they get really angry when they realize that you're serious. And then you have to go through this very difficult process, and it takes years before people eventually accept what it is that you've suggested and the changes that actually are made or implemented, however you want to phrase it. But there are people who are going to push back against suffrage or opening up the process to more people. Their arguments are going to be people without a stake in the social order should not have a voice in governing it. Votes of those dependent on the wealthy for livelihoods would be controlled by their patrons, enhancing the power of the rich, meaning that the poor might support demagogues. And lastly, only the independent and virtuous were fit to govern. Best evidence of was being a property-holding white Protestant male. Now, when I share this, I am in no way, shape, or form endorsing it. I'm merely explaining this is what some people thought. Going back when we talk about the late 1700s, early, almost mid-1800s. Gradually, this view lost ground to the argument for political equality implicit in the Declaration of Independence. And think about it. If you're going to run for office, if you have any chance of winning an election, you cannot hold views that are out of step with where attitudes are going. In other words, if there's been a shift and now people look at it differently and they're opening up the process and the whole concept of a property qualification disappears, holding on to that way of looking at the world will only be to your political detriment, which means an increased likelihood you're going to lose an election because your views will not be consistent with what most people believe. So also want to throw in the mix here, and I highly recommend that people read the book Democracy in America by Alexis de Tocqueville, who's a French observer. It's a great book, and this is a quote from it. The further electoral rights are extended, the greater is the need for extending them. For after each concession, the strength of the democracy increases. I mean, think about that. If it is this unfolding process, and I like to think in terms of rings, okay? Think of it like rings. If you're expanding the rings, and by doing so, like imagine a circle, or think about like tree rings. As you go out, think about it, there's like a center. And then as you go out, there's more and more and more rings. Think of the rings as like expanding the process to bring more people into it. These people have the opportunity to participate. That means choosing the personnel of government, running for positions themselves, and just serving. Service takes on, there's far more to this than just running for elected office. There's also just working within an institution. I'll give you an example, a contemporary example. A friend of mine from graduate school, her name is Sophia, she works in the Congressional Research Service in the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. She also worked as a librarian in the U.S. Senate. She has not run for office, but she has worked in the federal government. And it's not just the people who run for office that make it all possible. It's also all the other people who have regular everyday jobs. And if you ever get the chance, make sure you go to D.C. You can visit your legislators' offices, of course. But if you ever get the chance to go to D.C., you want to see the monuments and maybe visit the White House and do all this. But you also want to go in and maybe walk the halls of Congress. You're going to see a lot of people in there who are, maybe you'll run into some elected officials if you do stop in their office, but they also have staffers working for them. And there are thousands of people working in the federal bureaucracy, right? In places like the Smithsonian Institution, in the Library of Congress, and other. Office of Management and Budget, Congressional Budget Office, all these different places. Anyway, I'm just going to give you some examples. They make it possible. Okay, suffrage for women. Democratic logic that justified giving the vote to all white men didn't stop there. It nurtured demands that all adult citizens be eligible. Women's suffrage movement grew directly out of the anti-slavery movement, sharing its underlying ideals with some of its activists. They felt betrayed when the Civil War amendments enfranchised Newly freed black men, not women. You think about that. 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment. 13th, ending slavery. 14th, granting rights to citizens. 15th is the right to vote for men of color, not women. The right to vote for women will not come until 1900s, just over 100 years ago, 1920. Okay. And really, I should qualify that by saying the following. That was a federal amendment that applies to all of the states. However, in some states, women were able to cast a ballot. Mention some in a second here. Resistance overcome by a combination of social change, expansion of education for both sexes, entry of women into the workforce. Once again, these are, when you think about how we shift, think about like my parents, my dad is in his 80s. My mom's in her late 70s. My dad's in his early 80s. Think about this. The world is a much different place when my parents were young. Like 1940s. It's a different place. We've shifted. Some professions are open to women in a way that they once were not or weren't historically. Okay. More women are going to school, so forth. It would make sense that by extension, people would also want the ability to participate in the political system. Political need. Women were expected to vote for family values in raw frontier communities, places like Wyoming and Utah. Now, you would not necessarily equate voting rights for women in what we know about these states historically, but it is in fact the case. And I also want to add this. As women's suffrage grew at the state and local levels, politicians competing for women's votes naturally supported further expansion. Some people just could see where it was going. And they're like, okay, well, if I want to win this position in government, then I'm going to need the support of a variety of people. Right? Okay. Who uses the right to vote? Individual factors affecting turnout. People participate when they can meet the costs and appreciate benefits. Those with money, education, experience, free time, and self-confidence find it easier. I mean, think about it for a second. The fact that you are taking this class makes you, not in, I would say, every case, but probably many cases, more knowledgeable about these institutions than people who have not taken this class. And so we see this. People who are more highly educated are more inclined to cast a ballot. Right? Those with greater psychological stake. Example given, a concern with issues, sense of obligation to carry out duties as citizens, interest in parties, in politics receive greater benefits. They're more engaged. People with deeper roots in their communities are more likely to go to the polls, as are individuals with greater confidence in their ability to understand and engage politics. So that's internal efficacy. And then the ability to influence decisions is external efficacy. I also want to throw this in here. We say deeper roots. What does that mean? Longer time residents, homeowners, church members, and people with jobs. These are folks who are more invested in their communities. When you think about that if you own the property, you're probably concerned about the value of your home. You're probably concerned about the quality of your neighborhood. You're probably, quality of life in your neighborhood. You're probably concerned about if you have kids, the schools that they go to, and the infrastructure. What are the streets, and do we have parks? Can I take my kid to the park? So forth. When you think about all that, you're more invested. So that's what I mean when you say deeper roots. That's what I immediately think of. Okay. Age and education have the strongest influence on voting. I will say this, older people are more inclined to vote than younger people. Folks who are college age and into their 20s, oftentimes they're largely disengaged. People who are retired, usually very engaged. I've been engaged. I've been long paying attention to the process. And of course, this is one opinion I will share. I encourage people to participate. However, I don't hold it against them if they choose not to participate, because that's not a decision I get to make. And I never ask people. But I will encourage you to vote, because I think it's important to help choose the personnel of government. But it's also, you think about what's been on the ballot here in Nevada. last fall. I mean, we had minimum wage, equality, so forth. There's a bunch of different issues that end up on the ballot. You can have a ballot initiative depending on where you live. You can have a referendum, and depending on the state, that's going to determine what might make its way. And depending on the issues that are popular at any given moment, that's also going to determine what finds its way onto the ballot. But it's not just choosing the people who are running for offices. It's also making decisions about taxes too. So I would encourage people to partake, right? African Americans and Hispanics are less likely to vote, as are people living in the southern states or states bordering the South. And a woman is more likely to turn out than a man in presidential elections. I'm just telling you about what the data tells us. Just sharing what the data tells us. And that's what we're very interested in, because this is political science. It's a discipline of political science. We are one of multiple social science, I guess you could say, fields. Economics, psychology, sociology, anthropology. Some people like to put history in that category. I'm not one for including history in the social sciences, even if it deals with facts. But that's just my professional opinion there on my field. And technically, yes, I have a doctorate in political science and a master's degree in history, so I have degrees in both fields. Okay, moving on. Let's take a look at institutional factors affecting turnout. The more onerous the registration requirement, the higher the cost of voting. After the Civil War, Southern states adopted poll taxes, literacy tests, and requirement that voters register periodically to discourage African Americans. That's all illegal, of course, in the year 2023. By that I mean poll taxes, literacy tests, and other issues. Schemes to skew the electorate for political advantage are by no means a thing of the past. More than a dozen states adopted requirement that voters show a picture ID. I lived in Texas for 4.5 years. We had that on the books. It got passed. I remember going to the polling place, and they had options. Like, if you didn't have your ID, or if you didn't have a state ID or a driver's license, you could show like a utility bill and then sign an affidavit. And now, this is the point I want to make here. Texas initially enacted one of the most restrictive rules or laws on the books in the country, saying that you need a photo ID, driver's license, or a state ID in order to vote. Then they got sued. The state got sued, and then they backpedaled, and that's when they decided, okay, well, utility bill, and you sign an affidavit saying that you really are who you claim to be. But we do have voter ID in multiple states. Some people look at that as an attempt to discourage people from casting their ballots. Some people look at it as protecting the election process. What you think is up to you. I don't make decisions for other people. And there's plenty of articles about that online if you just do some Google searching. All right. Or if you're more interested, find any articles you want to share them with me. I'm more than happy to tell you about the source, whatever sources you find. Or if you have any questions, you're always more than welcome to send me an email. Okay. That's that. Social connections. Create incentives to participate. Coworkers note of who's performing their duty. Provide plenty of free information through casual conversations touching on politics and deliberate efforts of political activists. People participate because they are asked. I want to also add this. Social pressure plays a role. That can stimulate turnout. Okay? But think about this. If you know other people, like let's say you go into the office and your colleagues are talking about, hey, how they voted earlier today, or how they voted, depending on the state you live in. Some states have early voting, some states have mail-in ballot. I mean, I've had a variety of different experiences. I remember when I first started voting in the election in 1992, we had punch cards in Illinois. When I went to Arizona, we had fill in the bubble, kind of like a standardized test. When I went to Texas, we had electronic voting machines. We also had early voting. I remember going to the community center using an electronic voting machine there. In California, is the first time I ever had the mail-in ballot. This is even before the pandemic. Like, they mailed the ballot to me, and I could fill it all out and then drop it in the mail to go back. Right? And we've also seen here as a little bit of a change too in Nevada in more recent years that we've had the ranked choice voting, at least in the primary. Okay, I want to say this. We create incentives to participate. If people are talking about it and they're saying, yeah, did you vote? Well, I voted. Did you vote? Oftentimes people don't want to talk about who they cast their ballot for because they don't want to end up in arguments with people in the office, which I can totally understand. And you're not obligated to share that with anyone. And no one has a right to force you to vote for someone you're not interested in casting a ballot for. That's against the law, just to let you know. Just because people are voting a certain way in an office does not mean that they get to impose their views upon anyone. They don't get to do that. It's illegal. Not an employer, not a colleague, no one. Just so remember that, please. Provide plenty of free information through casual conversations touching on politics. Yes, we pick up bits and pieces. Let's be honest, a lot of people don't go and do hardcore research into candidates or issues. They pick up information from other people around them in various contexts of their life. I like to call them the context of a person's life. Okay. Deliberate efforts of political activists. There are people who are out there who are trying to get you to vote, yay or nay, for this person or that person. Yes, that's got to be mentioned here. Okay, I want to end by saying the following. Assorted demographic and institutional influences on voting produce an electorate in which wealthy, well-educated, older white people are overrepresented, and the poor, uneducated, young, and non-white are underrepresented. So once again, wealthy, well-educated, older white people are overrepresented, and poor, uneducated, young, and non-white people are underrepresented. Just want to share that with you. That's what we know from the data. Research has shown that one of the most effective ways to turn a non-voter into a voter is through a personal appeal. Social pressure can go a long way there. Also makes me think about like emails. Sometimes like when you're doing advocacy work and you send emails to people, they can be more easily ignored. But when you go to folks individually and you say, hey, Cheryl, could you help me with this? Cheryl might just have, been really busy and not noticed the email. And since it wasn't a high priority, she maybe even ignored it. That's been known to happen in the office. But if you go and talk to someone personally and you say, we'd really appreciate your vote. I mean, I've had people stop and, knocking on my door saying, hey, we're here on behalf of this campaign. We'd really appreciate it if you would get out to vote on whatever the date is. And I'm just like, well, no worries. I've already cast my ballot. Oh, great. Yeah. And so forth. It's been known to happen. Okay. But talking to people, that really can make a difference. 2020 voter turnout is estimated to be the highest in 120 years. You can see here from the graph. Mid to high 60% range, which still is lower than some other countries. Voter turnout by race and Hispanic origin, presidential elections 2008 to 2020. You can see this. Why didn't you vote in the 2020 presidential election? Percent of registered voters who didn't vote said the main reason was they weren't interested or felt their vote wouldn't make a difference. They didn't like the candidates or campaign issues. That's a large, when you add that together, that's a large percentage of people. 33%, 1/3 of the people who didn't vote, those are the reasons why. 4%, they forgot. I guess they must have missed all those campaign signs and all the ads. I don't know what to say here. They had concerns about COVID-19 pandemic. I'd like to look into what other is because I really don't know. But that's hyperlinked in the event that you'd like to go and read more. Also here, this is from the Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance. This is the countries, different countries in the world with their specific voter turnout. You'll notice there Australia is really high, as is Sweden and Denmark. And you'll notice if you scan down the list, the United States is pretty far down from the top. You'll notice that. Okay. How do voters decide? Voter must choose the standards and then determine which candidate meets the standards. Of course, people are going to think about, well, who's better and what's relevant? I mean, there's a lot that goes into this. It's complicated. People are complicated. Perhaps you've noticed. All right. If someone doesn't have ideas that you think are relevant to your life, I don't see a person being really inclined to cast a ballot for that individual. I don't see it happening. They economize by using simple cues as cognitive shortcuts and relying heavily, if selectively, on free information delivered by news media. But not only news media, campaign advertising, opinion leaders, their own experiences, especially if you work in a certain field. Like my sister works in human resources. She's an HR executive in the Phoenix, Arizona area. And we have had conversations about the Affordable Care Act 2010, also known as Obamacare. We've talked about that before because that certainly affected how the workplace, different companies she worked for, how they operated. And I'm in the field of education, right? So I pay attention to, at the state level, for example, how we're funding it. But nonetheless, depending on the field you're in, that can definitely inform the way you look at various issues and how much you pay attention, and then which candidates you're inclined to gravitate toward if they have a message that is consistent with your values. I want to say this too. Choices are made under conditions of considerable uncertainty because likelihood of casting a decisive vote is so tiny. People find it makes little sense to put much effort into acquiring information that might reduce uncertainty. I think that's a polite way of saying that a lot of people don't think their vote really matters as much or matters that much, so therefore they don't put a lot of energy or invest a lot of time into doing homework. And to be very honest, it can take. I mean, I've gotten sample ballots in the mail. I have spent, I don't know, sitting there going through the ballot, looking up all the different candidates. I probably spent a good hour or two. Really depends on how long the ballot is. When I lived in Houston, Texas, we had a very, very long ballot with a lot. And I had to do a lot of Google searching because some of those lower offices you don't see any ads and you don't even see signage. You got to go and look up these people. And I have a rule, like I have to be able to find information about you online. Otherwise, I don't have a reason to cast my ballot for you in the election. Sorry. So there has to be a newspaper article where you were interviewed. There has to be a web page that you've created. There has to be like a Q&A that you did with a media outlet, something, because I got to get the information from somewhere. And if I can't find any, and poking around online can take time. All right. But it's worth it. I'm going to say this much. It is worth it because it's the process. It's the nature of the process. Assessing the issues and policy outcomes. Personal experience supplies politically relevant information. Looking for a job, shopping at the supermarket, or trying to get a mortgage to buy a house teaches people about unemployment, inflation, mortgage rates, respectively. I can tell you this. When we had the pandemic, and not just the pandemic, went through the pandemic, you go back to the Great Recession, we saw the unemployment rate spike. We've seen inflation over the last year or two. The price of goods has gone up. In some cases, it's like, wow, it's noticeable when I go to the grocery store. And mortgage rates. I was just looking at them last night. They're high. So what that means is it costs you more money to borrow when you want to purchase a home. Because that's what you have to do. Most people have to borrow the money from a lender. And then the percentage, the interest rate's going to affect how much you have to pay back, right? Because there's the principal and then there's the interest. Okay, won't get into that too deeply, just want to say it. And which policy positions matter depends on the voters and current circumstances. Abortion, that's been the news with the Supreme Court's decision in June of 2022. Gun control, because we've had a lot of these mass shootings across the country in various places. That's been a hot topic. Environmental protection, I would say, depends on where you live. Certainly environmental protection can be a topic of discussion. I think that climate change has probably been, the last few years, has got a lot of attention, last decade or so. And of course, taxes and spending. Taxes definitely, they get people fired up because folks are like, I don't want to have to pay more. And if you live in Nevada, you know that we don't have a state income tax. And I think a lot of people would like to keep it like that. Now, that's state level government. We do pay a federal income tax if you have a job somewhere. But point being is people don't like to hear that taxes are going up. So whether they be local, state, or federal. Okay. I'm just looking at my handouts here. Voter cues and shortcuts. Candidates have an incentive to misrepresent themselves because they're out to win votes. Perhaps that you've seen this yourself, that sometimes people take their liberties with the truth. In other words, they bend it a little bit. Maybe it's not totally, they're not totally being dishonest, but they're not being totally forthright either. Like cherry picking certain information and leaving out other pieces of information because what you've chosen makes you look better. Framing issues certain ways so that you can garner more support. This has been known to happen. Voters can deal with this problem by taking cues from opinion leaders, often formalized through endorsements from organizations and individuals. Yes, newspapers will endorse candidates. So will organizations like unions, for example. Make predictions based on candidates' personal characteristics. There are considerations. Candidates' demographic features give clues about personal values, competence, experience, honesty, knowledge, leadership. And here's another set: sex, race, ethnicity, age, and place of residence. The rationale: voters cannot anticipate all the problems and issues that will come up after the election, nor can they easily monitor the behavior of their elected officials. There's a lot that we just don't know. I mean, first of all, when someone's running for an office, we're going off of their campaign to make decisions, at least in part. And if the media's done any digging into their background, their life. Have they made any serious mistakes? If so, have they learned from them? I mean, they can go on and on and on. Point being is this, though. We rely on these other sources because we don't necessarily have the time to go and dig into it ourselves. Most important information voters use to make predictions is party label. Label provides useful information for both the performance voting and issue voting. Performance deals with, what is government doing? Is it well? Is it going well or poorly? And then the in-party versus the outs. In other words, who's currently in office? What have they done correctly? What have they done wrong? What do we think about what it is that they've been able to accomplish or they failed to accomplish? Yeah. Power of party identification. Best single predictor of the vote in federal elections. The central focus of research. Yeah, we call it party ID. Since the 1950s, the American National Election Study has asked scientifically selected samples of the public to set a set of questions probing their strength and direction of their partisanship. About 90% of partisans voted for their party's presidential candidate. Independents can split. In general, the weaker a respondent's partisanship, the more likely he, she, z was to vote for a minor party candidate. In elections from 1956 to 2016, about 8% of presidential voters were self-identified partisans supporting their candidate. Fewer than 10% are pure independents. Okay. The basic necessities, candidates and messages. Candidate, person who can be portrayed as sufficiently qualified and trustworthy. Achieving this status is not as simple as it sounds. Members often run unopposed, run against candidates so lacking in experience, talent, temperament, or background. Presidential contests usually attract plenty of political talent, but even the pool may be affected by expectations. Yeah. Give the example of George Herbert Walker Bush. Ronald Reagan's vice president, who then won the election of 1988, took office in 89, but then he lost to Bill Clinton in 1992, despite the fact his popularity level is rather high in the wake of the Gulf War. Message is the answer to voters' questions. Question: why should I vote for this candidate rather than another? Shaped by candidates' theories about their beliefs, perceptions, values, and responses of different segments of the electorate, uncertainty is pervasive and information is valuable. Just looking at the information about voters, which means the candidates are going to, especially for the higher offices, invest heavily in research. They want to know what people are thinking. And remember, no survey is perfect, but it is a snapshot of a moment in time to get a sense as to what's going through people's heads, what's important to them, what's on their minds, right? And if you're running for office, you want to use that information to craft your message, because that's how you make yourself more appealing, right? Run hundreds of opinion surveys and conduct numerous focus group sessions in which a smaller number of ordinary citizens are observed as they talk with one another about candidates, issues, and events. I've seen the focus groups done on CNN and Fox. They get a handful of people together in a room and ask them questions. It's a way to get a sense of what people are thinking. Surveys are really broad, right? They go out to lots of different people. This is a bit different, right? When you get a focus group, you got half dozen, maybe 10 or so people sitting in a room all talking at different times, of course, because you got to hear from each person. But right. Messages candidates use in their campaigns depend very much on the national context and who is running against them. Of course, you got to pay attention to the existing political conditions, social conditions for that matter. Work hard to convey that they do get it. They understand and care about the concerns of their fellow citizens and common ground with voters of all sorts. People have to have a reason to cast a ballot for you on election day, so you've got to make yourself appealing to them. Prepare resumes highlighting their credentials, experience, and accomplishments. Political advertising and attacks, negative campaigning, pointed personal criticism of the other candidate is thus a normal, if sometimes ugly, component of the electoral process. However, it is effective. Messages emphasizing one candidate's suitability invite rebuttals. Like if you say, let's say you're running for office and you're putting out these ads that talk about the experience that you've had at different levels of government, how that'll inform the work you do going forward if you're so chosen. Okay? So our system affords people the opportunity to go after the opposition. Meaning, if they're talking about how qualified they are for the position, you, if you're running against them or if someone's running against you, they essentially can call your abilities into question in an attempt to discourage people from casting a ballot for you. So looking at the notes here, I have a few extra notes. Ads exploit uncertainty inherent in the delegation of authority to powerful agents. Research suggests that negative ads inform people about both candidates and may increase interest in elections. Simplicity, repetition, exaggeration, symbolism are therefore staples. Accuracy is not a priority. However, people do try to avoid lying outright. Repeat the theme ad nauseum. Put the information out there, ideas out there. Right. There's little evidence that people stay home on election day because they dislike attack ads. A lot of people say they don't like them because they find them obnoxious. But the evidence does not support the claim, or shall I say, there's no evidence to support this idea that people willfully stay away because they're angry by how folks have conducted themselves in the election itself. Planners begin by using past voting records, polling, and telephone or door-to-door canvassing. Support for candidates? That's what they're trying to figure out. Will people support the candidate? Strategists work to frame the choice. All right. The other necessity, campaign money. All right. Just look at the notes here. Regulating campaign money. If you're going to run, you're going to need supporters. You just can't have volunteers. You have people who are willing to make donations so you can pay for what all goes into the election process. Currently, the money spent on campaigns for federal offices comes from private sources. There are problems. Democracy demands political equality, one person, one vote. But we know that money is distributed unequally. There is people with more and people with less, or far more and far less. Privately financed elections raise the suspicion that elected officials will serve as agents of contributors rather than their constituents. Prior to the 1970s, campaign money was effectively unregulated. However, the limits have been circumvented. Higher cost, accelerated fear. Congress's response with the Federal Election Campaign Act of 1971 was extensively amended in 1974. Provided partial public funding for presidential campaigns. Required full public reporting of, and strict limits on contributions and expenditures in federal elections. Established the FEC, Federal Election Commission, to enforce law and publish information. Also, I want to say this when we say what information, specifically on campaign contributions and expenditures. And you can actually go to the Federal Election Commission website if you're interested and look at it. Now we also have a case we have to look at here. Buckley v. Vallejo, 1976. Upheld reporting requirements and contribution limits, prevent corruption or appearance of corruption. Rejected the spending limits on the ground that they interfere with political speech protected by the First Amendment. So they're going to monitor the money that's going into a person's campaign. But they're not going to, I'm just going to say, no, they're not. We're not going to have any kind of federal law anytime soon that I can see that would essentially put a cap on how much money a candidate can raise, to spend on advertisements, for example, transportation, hotel rooms, food. All right, I'm just looking down at this. Overturned, again, on First Amendment grounds, ceilings on how much of their own money candidates could spend on their campaigns and how much anyone could spend to agitate for or against candidates independently of candidates' campaigns. That sounds convoluted, but I don't think that it is. Congress liberalized FECA in 1979, amending the bill to amending the act, to allow unrestricted contributions and spending for state and local party building and get out the vote activities. In March 2002, Congress passed the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act. I remember this quite well. Prohibited parties from raising and spending soft money for federal candidates. So soft money's out. I also will tell you this, according to this federal statute, the limit for contributions, like if I want to give money to a candidate in like a 2-year election cycle, the limit for 2023-24 is $3,300. I remember when it was back in the low 2000s. That was initially the level they set it at. But it adjusts for inflation. So $3,300 is the maximum you can make to one candidate in one election cycle. Citizens United v. Federal Election Commission 2010. Court went further to invalidate any restriction on independent campaign spending by an organization, whether it be a corporation or a union. The PACs and super PACs can attempt to influence the outcome of the election itself, but they are not affiliated with the campaign, nor can they be. The one deal with the PACs, of course, is they can raise hundreds of millions of dollars. And usually it's with the goal of either getting someone in or getting someone defeated. And that can affect the kind of ads you see and the tone or the images they capture. Yeah. But yeah, there's a concern that these groups have more influence on the process than they should. Hence the political cartoon in the wake of the Citizens United ruling. Here is Catherine Cortez Masto. This is from her Open Secrets page, which she didn't create the page. The organization created these website and then, of course, monitors money and election process. And you can see how much she raised and spent. That's a lot of money. Up in the $60+ million range. How are campaign funds spent? Largest expense is advertising. From that, you get your presidential and Senate. If you can have television, radio, those two are the leading avenues by which people try to generate attention for whatever it is they're working on or doing this and so forth. I want to make sure I get this correct here. How are campaign funds spent? Largest expense is advertising. Television and radio are the leading. This is for both the presidential as well as the Senate races. Mailings can be targeted precisely to district residents. We're talking about the House of Representatives there. Only a small portion goes for speeches, rallies, soliciting votes door to door, shaking hands at the factory gate. Campaigns display imagination with gimmicks that gain free media exposure. Large share of congressional campaign funds pays for expenses not directly connected to researching voters. One study found that nearly 1/4 of the money spent went into overhead, staff salaries, office and furniture rental, computers and other equipment, telephone calls, travel, legal, accounting services. That is the end. Thank you for listening.